This is the London FinTech Podcast, brought to you by your host, Mike Ballerman, bridging the worlds of suits and t-shirts, of finance and technology, bringing you insights, stories, and inspiration from the golden age of opportunity and innovation happening in London right now.
Hi, this is Mike Ballerman, and this is London FinTech Podcast, episode 160, brought to you in association with Smart Pension and theenlistedboard.com. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Clay Wilkes, CEO and co-founder of Galileo Financial Technologies, to discuss the attributes of being a great entrepreneur. Insiders in the audience will know of Galileo, the rest of you may not. However, Galileo's APIs are used by a phenomenal 95% of US digital banking, an amazing stat, and in London, apparently, 5 out of the top 5 digital banks. Global clients include Monzos, Revoluts, Robinhoods, and TransferWises. Their APIs do exciting things like account record, ledger, authorization, settlement, ACH, whatever that is, fraud, dispute, customer service, business intelligence, and all leading forms of contactless payment, and much, much more. But that kind of stuff is interesting only for the, well, I was about to say oily-fingered engineers, but that's a little bit out of date these days, so perhaps these days it's the skinny-jeaned, checked-shirted engineers. For the rest of us, zooming up from the APIs under the hood, Galileo went one further than selling APIs recently, or is that renting them? I'm not sure, and recently sold itself to SoFi for a cool $1.2 billion, thereby making it into that rarest of beasts, not the so-called unicorn, beloved of tech media, which is based on breathless auto-hyping PR releases, extrapolating ad infinitum what the latest VC paid for a small slug of a company, but your real, genuine, single-horned animal that someone liked so much they paid $1 billion for it. A real unicorn is definitely a rara animalis. Many have formed fintechs, but few have sold their animalis for $1 billion. So, as I could certainly do with cashing in the podcast for a figure near or thereabouts that amount, and you founders out there might like to do the same, whilst those of you in big company roles stare out of the window and dream, if you're lucky enough, that one day you will do the same, I thought rather than just another episode about payments, bank accounts, APIs, and other such excitements, we might ask Clay the $1 billion question. Namely, of course, so how do you make $1 billion? How hard can it be? Plenty to talk about, so let's get on with the show. Good morning, Clay. Thanks for joining me on the show today.
Absolutely thrilled to be here, Mike. Thanks for having me.
So I was actually just thinking of something, and I actually Googled it before we started, and I couldn't get an answer from Google, which is a very strange phenomenon in the modern world. I mean, when I was a kid, you couldn't find out the answer to most things, actually. It was a very different world. And I don't know whether you know the answer to this question, which I said good morning to you. But it's very strange because you're in Salt Lake City where it's definitely morning, and I'm south of London where it's definitely afternoon. So I was wondering, do I say good morning to be polite to you because it's morning to you, or do I say good afternoon because that's what I'd say because I'm sitting here? And I didn't actually know the answer. Do you know the answer?
You know, that's a great question. And I think good afternoon would be appropriate. But if I were in the reverse role, I would probably say good afternoon to my guest. In other words, I would have gone to your place and time. But I don't know if that's the right answer.
Well, I didn't find one, so any listeners who are better at Googling than I am can Google it properly and please share it with me. I think it certainly sounds, saying good morning at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a very odd thing to do, but it's an interesting question of protocol. And of course, these protocols, when they were developed, were designed a few thousand years before it was possible to speak to people in a different time zone. So in terms of kicking things off, we've had many entrepreneurs on the podcast before, and a number of entrepreneurs, the sort of 30-something genre, seem to try and do everything in life at the same time. So some of them are moving house, they've got a fintech, and they're having babies and everything all at the same time. Goodness knows how they fit it in. But in terms of having babies, you're quite good at having babies, or rather your wife is quite good at having babies.
It's true. We have 10 children. We're here today, Mike, and I'm thrilled, by the way, as I said, to talk about business and entrepreneurship and starting a business and making it all work in the world of fintech. But it's important to stay focused on what's truly important. Now, 10 children might be too much focus on what's important, but family is certainly important. And it's really where we and I derive the meaning of life. So
yes, absolutely. And it's always tempting to fall into correlation is causation, but I can certainly see that having 10 children is a great motivation to go out and make more money than if you sort of have 1.6 or whatever the average is. If you go for one more, of course, you'll have an English football team. So in terms of the career journey, diving in because sort of $1 billion is quite a lot of dollars, so we need to start in the first few.
Can I tie these two ideas together? And that is that maybe I should have...
You're selling the children.
Maybe I should have made $10 billion if the goal was to get to $1 billion. So
yes, well, when you were talking about that, I thought that actually it's probably not, because there's a saying, I think in all around the world, that wealth disappears in 3 generations. And certainly going back to the 80s when my career started, and there were still quite a few sort of aristocratic families around in the city, it was generally the case that inheriting too much money didn't do you too much good, actually, because you lost the hunger. And even at a sort of far more modest middle class level in the UK, there's quite a lot of kids who are not from wealthy families, but are from comfortably middle class families, who were given the idea that, follow your passion, follow your bliss in life. Mm-hmm. And they grow up with this, and they sort of get to the mid-20s, and they haven't actually got down to, if you pardon the expression, sort of shoveling shit or doing whatever it takes, or cleaning toilets or something like that. So, yes, it cuts both ways, doesn't it? So, on to the career journey then, in terms of the money, but that is a side effect of doing something amazingly productive for the world that the world is very pleased to see. But in terms of your career journey, how did you get to founding Galileo, which I think you founded in something like 2000, actually?
Yeah, so it's an interesting start. As I had been retired for 6 years prior to starting Galileo, and as I was trying to think about what to do, I had several ideas, and my wife, 2 things. One was, you're going to be held accountable for all the things that you are, kind of inspired to go do that you don't do. And 2, why don't you get out of the house and go set an example for your children? So, this is back to your earlier point, but I had taken an earlier company public. It was based on telecommunications. I had patented voice over IP, and was really waiting to figure out what to do next. I was doing my own investing. This is when the idea for Galileo came about.
So were you always an entrepreneur from the beginning?
The first part of my journey, no, I was an employee. I spent time in my career in operating systems, communications, technology, working for larger companies, IBM and Sperry among them. So no, I was not always an entrepreneur, but looking back at my childhood, technology and entrepreneurship were certainly very prevalent.
It's interesting because in the previous podcast, also with an American guest, albeit living in London, we were talking quite a lot about culture in companies and how the company reflects society and how society reflects the company and the sort of the circularity of it. And I was referring to the good old days in Europe, pre-company, when guilds ran everything. And before we dive into the sort of the attributes of entrepreneurship and how to grow the successful company. So back in the day of guilds, you had a whole system of being an apprentice and working up to be a master. So masterpiece, as many listeners may or may not know, literally was the piece of work you produced back in the day. So if you joined the Guild of Carpenters, to become a master carpenter, you would produce your masterpiece. It's a bit like your sort of, your dissertation or your final exam.
Oh, interesting.
And then you're a master and you're allowed to go and do it. So you're doing the masterpiece. So for most of the time in Europe was based around, going back to sort of kids and all that kind of stuff, that you'd join at the bottom, you'd literally sort of sweep up the shavings for a few years in the way that you would still do in a Zen monastery and all that kind of stuff. And you'd be trained up into something. So you wouldn't have this kind of bookish learning that we have in universities these days in the West, where you read a bunch of books and you write an essay and you say, I know about entrepreneurship, or I've got an MBA or something like that. But you would literally sort of sit at the feet of somebody like yourself for sort of 5 or 10 years, and you would learn by this old-fashioned method of absorption, actually. And I was watching a program about a Japanese chef. He cooked a certain type of dish. He was the 3rd generation in his family. He'd been doing it for 30 years, and he was saying how fascinating it was. And he said he learned without being told any words. He learned by just being next to his father or something like that. So just before we dive into the entrepreneurship, but leading into it quite nicely, in terms of learning, how do you think you learnt to be an entrepreneur? Did you read a book? Did you read 1,000 blog posts on how to be an awesome entrepreneur and go and do it? Or did you pick up stuff from the companies you were in? I mean, and going forward, in terms of the thousands in the audience, for people out there who'd like to be entrepreneurs, and lots of people do, how would you recommend people actually learn to be an entrepreneur?
It's a great comment and question. So 2 points. One is on technology, and my father had his PhD in computer science, and So that was the last thing that I wanted to do or to be, although because I had grown up in the computer labs literally from age 8 on. And this is back in the very early days of computing. So that was something that was very familiar to me, but I didn't want to study that. So I studied zoology and wanted to go to medical school, and all of that, that became derailed. So that's on technology. On the point of entrepreneurship, I've heard it said that, great entrepreneurs come from fathers of failed entrepreneurs. And that was true in my life too. So while my father was a college professor, he had a number of businesses that were just bad ideas and poor execution. So as I watched that kind of growing up, I think, back to your guild and master accomplishment, I think that was my journey, was watching my father.
Yes, the absorption thing is very interesting, and I think I've sort of made jokes in the podcast before about noticing daughters. I mean, mine now in the early 20s, and what they're like, very simplistically speaking, for a father from sort of below 10 to 20, 20 to 30, and that I'm told that they actually they come back a little bit. But you certainly want daughters below 10 because they think daddy's wonderful, can do everything, which of course is the most accurate perception they ever have. When they become teenagers and the sort of hormones kick in and all that kind of stuff, they start sort of practicing, learning the skills that sort of cat knocks mice around by sort of rolling eyes at dad and all that kind of stuff. And then going back to sort of joining the world of work, my elder daughter was very keen to take none of my advice whatsoever when she was leaving university a year ago. Good for her. Anyway, a year later she did relate, swallowing her pride, that she thought she might get a job in fintech actually. So it's funny about people actually absorb lessons from other human beings. I mean, we are primates, we absorb it.
Right.
Almost unconsciously, when actually if you tell messages, your kids all get to a certain age where if you tell them stuff, it's probably best to tell them the opposite.
And you don't know whether they're taking it in or not, and time will tell.
We fathers of daughters live in hope, no doubt fathers of sons too. So there was this question of we absorb it. I like the point about seeing one's family sort of struggle with things, because it's almost like at a subconscious level in the back of your brain, you're trying to work out how dad should have done it,
Right.
And so you're trying to solve problems. So before we dive into some of the attributes of being an entrepreneur, let's just talk about attributes per se first. So we've got this first challenge of attributes, which is theory versus practice, the sort of the nice word versus the reality. It's what I call the Roget's thesaurus problem. We can look through Roget's thesaurus and pick out all the nice words. So we could say to our children, or sort of to entrepreneurs, be wise, be strong, be valiant, be humble. That's fantastic advice, of course. But if it's that easy, then everyone would be wise, strong and valiant and humble every minute of their life. I mean, everyone would be hardworking and all these attributes we're about to mention. So what do you have to say from your experience now of having created a couple of companies about this gap between sort of almost Platonic theory about these lovely words, and actually there's just a reality of being a daily human being with babies, and you feel rough one morning and you feel sort of tired or not well? I mean, what's this gap between sort of where the rubber hits the road?
Yeah, the point is, what defines it, and we can all know it on an academic level, but putting it into practice is much more difficult, especially when day-to-day kind of comes full force against that. So I think you're spot on. You really do need to put these things into practice. And so, for example, be humble. How long does that apply? Does it apply from last night when I read it, or is it, over the course of a week, and I'm reminding myself of that regularly throughout the journey?
And in terms of your journey, do you think that you started with these attributes we'll come on to and tried to become them in the way that you go to the gym and you try and become fit by doing a bunch of practices? Or did you kind of almost discover them in a way that a sculpture discovers a sculpture out of stone?
I think there's a little bit of both. I was aware of the attributes we'll talk about here in a minute, going through the journey. But some of them, I'm reminded of a speech that Steve Jobs gave where he said, you're not going to be aware until you look back and connect the dots. And it's really only in backward vision that you have this ability. And so sitting where I sit right now, some of the attributes that we'll talk about were manifest through the journey, and others I was very much aware of and very much trying to practice the art of, if that makes sense.
Yes, and then before diving into these, and just so people don't get too excited, it is things like passion and focus and tenacity, but I just want to help people understand how you use some of these words rather than, it's the same as here's 6 awesome attributes of an entrepreneur and you memorize it, and as you say, it lasts for about 24 hours until you forget what they were. The other thing about sort of wisdom is that wisdom is very situational. And we can have an idea of balancing attributes. So just in terms of sayings, we have the saying, many hands make light work. But also we have too many cooks spoiling the broth. So at one level, these things are contradictory. But at another level, they are situational. So sometimes if you've got a lot of heavy lifting to do, many hands do help you move it all. Equally, in terms of too many cooks spoiling the broth, if you've got your company vision for 2021, you can discuss it with a whole bunch of people, but at the end of the day, some person or a very small number of people need to make a decision. Okay, we're going this way, guys. I know you want to go west, I know you want to go east, but we're going sort of northwest, and that's what we're all going to implement. Work hard is another one. So work hard is great. It's a very American attribute, but how long can you work, 18, 19, 20 hours a day, 365 days a year without, as it were, killing part of you that makes you the person that you are? You need to balance in a yin-yang way, working hard with sort of resting hard, or holidays, or being fresh, So how do you see the balance of attributes like that, rather than just trying to be all the nice words in the dictionary?
Yeah, I think that's right. Some of them absolutely need to be balanced. And this gets back to the beginning of the show. Well, what's important to you? And certainly if you're single-minded here, that can kind of narrow the overall joy of life, if you will. And some would say, well, being an entrepreneur requires a degree of single-mindedness. And I would say, yes, that's true. And it's how do you measure success? And I don't know that it can be measured in terms of economic units. So I think striking that balance is important as you look at some of these attributes.
Yes, and the individuality is also quite an important thing. So in a sense, in terms of this journey to entrepreneurship, it's part of sort of Maslow's hierarchy of needs at the top, is that one of the things is that actually most people are better off being a better version of themselves. I can try and be you, and you can try and be me, or you could try and be Steve Jobs. But a lot of it is about using your own strengths. Some simple example, you can have an extroverted, fantastic entrepreneur, and you can have an introverted one. They don't all have to go around sort of yelling at people in their faces as Jobs is alleged to have done. So right. How do you see that, not just with yourself, but other entrepreneurs that you've known?
Yeah, I think staying true to who you are is really a key part of, it's not one of the attributes we'll talk about here and I've outlined, but I think it's important because it allows you to kind of be you in the role. And I've tried to do that, although I haven't consciously stated it here as a key attribute. But I think your point is a very good one. And it gets back to some of the ones you were calling out in the dictionary. Steve Jobs may have been maybe the most remarkable of entrepreneurs, but was he a remarkable human being? I guess that's debatable.
Yes, exactly. So moving on to the attributes then, Clay, can you talk about some of these attributes, not just from the dictionary definition, but in terms of your experience of how you approach them, what the challenges were, and the reality of where the rubber's hitting the road on some of this stuff? Because what I want to avoid is the sort of motherhood and apple pie type of conversation. Motherhood's a good thing, yeah. Apple pie is a good thing. Going to bed early is a good thing.
Well, let's see if we can't actually have a piece of pie, because talking about pie is a great thing, but be good if we could actually enjoy some here. So the first point I would make is tenacity. And I don't have these all ranked in terms of priority, but if I did have them ranked, tenacity would be right at the top. So my advice to any entrepreneur is stay with it. And it's hard. There's going to be many, many times where you feel like, why am I doing this? Or I shouldn't be doing this, or things really feel stacked against me, or the industry has turned, and what should I be doing? So this notion of tenacity is key. And I'll to your point on balance, I'll try to strike a balance here with another attribute here in a few minutes. But I want to give an example of what I'm talking about here. In the early days of prepaid and what would become fintech, there were conferences as we were getting underway, industry conferences, and Galileo was a great early success at these conferences. And then some number of years into it, I went to a conference, and I remember sort of standing back against a wall and looking at this conference and feeling very much like this is the conference at which Galileo became irrelevant. In other words, the entire industry has sort of moved beyond Galileo. And then a few years went by, and I was having a conversation with a private equity firm. I'll actually mention who this was, General Atlantic. So this is a top tier private equity firm. And now the industry conferences were much, much larger, 10 to 15 times larger than when I had had the original thought of Galileo may be irrelevant. And the individual from this private equity firm pulled me aside and said, there are literally thousands of companies here, but there are only two of them that matter. And one of those is Galileo. And I thought, wow, what? And I remember that comment so distinctly because it was such a stark contrast to what I had felt only a few years earlier. In other words, now Galileo is powering these incredible companies like Chime and Robinhood and TransferWise, Varo, Monzo, some of those you mentioned, Revolut, Remitly, of course, SoFi, and many, many, many others, 70 out of the top 100. And their comment was, Galileo might be the most important company here. So it really is, a testament to this tenacity. And, I've also heard that entrepreneurship is largely just a pure force of will. And that's what you're up against many times.
Yes, we'll come back to the tenacity and the balancing attribute, which is flexibility, because tenacious, meaning to hold on to something, it really is a question of what you're holding on to. So
right.
If you hold on to the answer being northwest, then when the winds and everything's blowing in that direction, you'll be right. But when the winds have changed 180 degrees, if you're tenacious, you'll be ploughing on to northern wastelands of Canada and be quite lonely. So I'd be interested in hearing that, because obviously, notoriously, in the tech world or startup world in general, you've got the sort of the pivot thing. But if you're tenacious and all you're ever doing is pivoting and changing direction, that's just Brownian motion. But in terms of the force of will, I quite like that, because it's not always emphasise. One of the things that actually I do like about Western, the theology compared to Eastern, is the idea that man is made in God's image, or the imperfect version. The point being is that Genesis, as I recall, starts with, in the beginning was the Word, and God created the universe with the Word. Now, if one is a tiny, tiny, tiny version of that, a gazillionth of % of it, it still means that you have, as a human being, the ability to create with a word. You can form with the word the unmanifest into the manifest. You can create something that's just an idea in your mind into reality. That isn't so much in Eastern religions. I mean, you've got the mysterious Tao, which is doing its thing, but there isn't so much reference to you can take some of the Tao and, like a potter with the clay, you can form it into something like that. And a lot of the Buddhism, being a sort of an Indian philosophy, does tend to lean on the side of, well, let's not worry about the world too much. We'll close our eyes on that and watch the breath come in and out. I'm not being rude, because actually I've got a lot of time for the Buddhist stuff. So yes, it is this sort of bizarre thing that of all the animals, not all the animals, some of them have got some small creativity, but man's creativity, for better and for worse, as we see all around us, is a unique attribute. And what drives that? It's like the horsepower is, in a sense, your willpower. You're like a sort of 1,000 horsepower motor car there, or potter of the unmanifest and creating the unmanifest into the manifest.
You're bringing up a really key point here. And I think it plays into this notion idea of one of the attributes that we want to talk about, and it's a great segue into it, is vision. And that is that your value proposition, in other words, the way you see the world, needs to be well defined, and the economic model needs to be well understood, at least in your own mind. And I can talk about that here in a minute in the terms of companies that are like, well, let's get market share and we'll figure out the economics later. But that's a different story. In 2000, we started with the idea that payment platforms were not up for the challenges and opportunities of the modern internet era. And so if you went back and looked in the kind of late 1990s, early 2000s, what you would find is that payment platforms were large, monolithic, rigid, inflexible, incapable of sort of doing anything in this internet age, and certainly APIs didn't exist. First Data, as an example, which largest in North America, 480 million lines of COBOL make up that system. And so, this is not a platform that you would want to be powering the modern digital age. And yet it's the platform and platforms like it that power much of the financial services industry, even still today. And so how do you move into a technology environment and era and try to preserve the ways in which these things happen? We'll talk about the innovator's dilemma here and the role that innovation plays here in just a minute. But this idea of vision, you need to have it, and you need to be able to bring people to that vision. If you can't, you're going to fail. And as an entrepreneur, this is really perhaps the most important notion of being an entrepreneur, and that is really putting on your sales hat and converting people to your vision.
Yes, you have an idea in your mind, and I like this point about sort of selling the vision, because what it does do is slightly change this word attribute that I'm talking about much more to the apprenticeshipy to master model, which is a skill. It's a skill we all learn. When you're sort of 5 years old, you're not that good at selling anything to anybody in particular. You can probably manipulate your mum or dad to get ice creams or more or less successfully, but that's about it. Whereas one of the skills that we all develop simply by talking it is the ability to enthuse people with your vision.
That's right.
And magnetize them.
Let me share a non-fintechy sort of story here related to this, and that has to do with telecommunications. The earlier idea that I took public, I had first patented the idea for voice over IP, and we were out talking to various analysts and investment banks and whatnot. And on the roadshow and the journey, you meet a lot of very interesting people, and many of them are resistant to the idea. But I want to go back in time here for just a minute, and that is that AT&T in North America had by far the largest the market share. Even though that they had been broken up into Ma Bell and the Baby Bells at the time that this is occurring, there's still a very, very large player in long distance. And they had the lowest cost basis, and they had the highest revenue and the highest margin in the industry. And the most dominant question that I received from the investment bankers, who you would think would know. Now, remember that I was taking this company public. This predated Netscape, and it predated Yahoo, the first two known internet companies, if you will, or large. And the question was, how are you going to compete with AT&T with these sorts of economic forces and these sorts of economic conditions? And my response was, actually, that's not the right question. The question is, how is AT&T going to compete with me? Because I can do for 2/100ths of a cent what requires 2.3 cents. Now, they had 17 cents per minute on average revenue, 2.3 cents per minute on cost, and I could do it at 2/100ths of a cent. Well, at AT&T, the company, they actually went out of business, and the brand was bought by one of the Baby Bells. What they quoted as putting them out of business was voice over IP.
Oh, wow.
And so this idea of stay with your vision, and it's really important. Again, back to Apple, we all look at the iPhone, but you only need to go back a few years earlier than that and see some failed handheld Newton as failed experiments with that company.
Yes, and one of the things about vision, it's a very rare sense. I mean, we can taste things in our mouth, we can smell things relatively near us. But vision, depending on where you're sitting, you can actually see for many miles. I presume that in terms of the sharpness of eyes, in terms of seeing into the future, that's quite important for the entrepreneur, because almost in a sense it's your clarity of how well you can see into the future. I can see kind of 3 to 5 years ahead. Now we can all say that, but how well we can do it is a different thing entirely.
That's very true. I don't know what defines vision, and if there's some sort of equivalent to, say, natural athletic ability for vision. I'm not sure, or if this is a trait that can be developed by anyone. But I know that successful entrepreneurs must have vision, and they must be able to bring people over to that vision, as I mentioned. And it brings me to a point that I'd like to talk about, which is this idea of strong partnership. Choose those people, surround yourself with those people that, one, have been brought over to your vision, but two, can really reinforce your own capabilities. In other words, there may be holes in your skill set, and if you'll bring people into this partnership, both in terms of key employees and others that can complement your skill set, you're going to be adding to, which is really key to what you do as an entrepreneur. Your book, Mike, on making your board an engine of growth. I love the idea here, and this is what do you do for your partners in terms of equity partners? And we went down a path deferring that. When we finally did make a choice around our key equity partner, we chose Excel, which is an incredible company. It has an incredible track record of creating success stories out of API companies. It was really, really key, and there's a great collaboration there. So I like the point that you make in your book about this board as an engine of growth, and it is key.
Excellent. On this point of partnership, the Oracle at Delphi had sort of know thyself above it, and that's terribly important. And coming back to this point about trying to be the best version of you, you can be partnering with a buddy to form a business, and it doesn't particularly matter if you're particularly somebody who's got vision wherever that comes from, and they're particularly somebody who likes staying in the office and just making it all happen and being COO like, that's fine. Or vice versa. If you don't have much vision, but actually you're quite good at just sort of, grinding it out and creating machinery and creating product, then you're going to be a good team, but that relies on having the honesty in the first place. Okay, so moving on to some of the other aspects. Quickly,
as companions to vision, I would say passion. Passion is really, your vision. Really the only strength that you have is can you bring others to your vision? And if you can't, you likely won't succeed. And then this idea of focus, which is, focusing on your vision. How do you really, day to day, how do you put this vision into practice? And again, a quote from Steve Jobs, all the things we needed to say no to so that we could succeed with what we succeeded with. So these ideas of vision, passion, and focus. We can talk a little bit about flexibility, which was your earlier point. How do you balance this with tenacity? And this gets back to when the circumstances change, what do you do? And I think that needs to be a part of absolutely of what you're doing day to day. And this can also be applied to larger incumbents in financial services as an example. So flexibility, what do you do? And this is the innovator's dilemma. So, the resource dependence that current customers drive a company's use of resources. Small markets struggle to impact the incumbent's larger market, and all of these disruptive forces in incumbent organizations. In that regard, I think banks right now are facing a key time, which is, are they going to allow tech and fintech to not only disrupt and disintermediate, are they going to respond? Or are incumbent organizations going to respond and do something in response to this incredible movement that's underway right now? So all those are good questions, which are worthy of podcasts in themselves. Maybe we just wrap up with one of the human things. If you started with family, which is a good background, other people maybe on their own may have the church or the monastery or whatever, or other resources. But in terms of, as I say, guilds being a microcosm of society, business is a microcosm of life. It's an activity that takes place in the context of life. And you don't need to live too many decades before realizing that some days you sort of wake up flat on your face in the gutter with scraped knees and scraped elbows in a certain amount of pain. And I quite like the idea that it's not a question of how many times you fall down. It's simply a question of standing up one more time than you fall over. And you mentioned the book, and I've mentioned the tale on the podcast before, certainly the first 24 entrepreneurs I spoke to, interviewing them about the board. What came over to me in terms of their confidential conversations with me was the pain that they'd been through, was the 4 o'clock in the morning cold sweats. I got it made my sort of skin creep in some senses. My God, it's tough. And I've known obviously quite a few entrepreneurs in London over the cycle in recent years. And you meet them when a fundraising is going badly. Boy, are you being tested then. It's like some awful cross-country run at school when it's freezing cold, it's wet, your feet hurt, your knees ache, and you aren't even halfway around. So what would you say about the inevitable times when, putting all these things to one side, you're actually just a human being and somehow you're halfway up the mountain and you don't feel you can go on, but somehow you've got to find the ability to go on? I 100% agree with your point. There were 20 or 30 or 40, literally, over the 20 years, there was times when we should have stopped. And that's why tenacity was sort of the first attribute that I talked about, where it felt so hard that that maybe it would have been better and easier just to stop. And staying with it is key. And it's in those moments. I'm a big marathon runner, or was earlier in my athletic career. And, you get up to mile 20, 22, 24, and you're still several miles from the journey. It's hard. It's really, really hard in those moments. And that's why tenacity is key. Yes, I guess the takeaway there is nothing persists like persistence. And I'm just thinking the infamous book by Joe Simpson, Touching the Void, where he fell down a crevasse, broke both his legs, and I've forgotten whichever South American mountain it was. He crawled down his hands and knees on that mountain with 2 broken legs. And he said, how did I do it? He said, I would never have done it
if I thought, how do I crawl down the mountain? I thought, no, I can't do that. He was the guy who did it. He said, I only ever thought about, can I crawl to that other rock there? Can I crawl 1 foot? Okay, I can do the 1 foot. It's sort of the salami slice. And it's a bit like life, really, in that you may want to give up, but can you do the next minute? Well, okay. Can you do the next half hour? So yes, persistence. I quite like the fact that actually a lot of what we're talking about here are human attributes for dealing in life in general. You can just as well talk about a marriage or a family or your whole journey from sort of cradle to grave kind of thing. And it really is a good example of where in business you can actually do something to help your brotherhood of man and womanhood around you. And at the same time, by going through that process, it's a bit like going to the gym. It's going to be bloody painful at sometimes on those weights and doing the running, but it's actually that pain that somehow makes you stronger. He says, being a complete couch potato. Anyway, before we turn the mirror on me too much, I'd like to thank all the listeners out there. I hope you've taken away some ideas from this show and can implement it in whatever area of your life you wish to, and that some of you will implement it in your businesses. I'd also like to thank my brand partners for the podcast, Smart Pension, who are fast, secure and free. Check out their UK workplace pensions at autoenrolment.co.uk. And I also signed up myself, theunlistedboard.com, which is my new project to provide resources for those on or aspiring to be on startup, scale-up, growth co and pre-IPO boards. Okay, so we've mentioned Galileo. The listeners are spread around the world, 191 countries, just under half in the UK and half elsewhere. Clay, so to those who are completely deeply in your sector, they may know about you already. Anybody who doesn't particularly know about Galileo, I do recommend your appearance last month on Peter Renton's podcast to hear a bit more about Galileo and the payments and the stuff you do if you want to fill that in. But otherwise, Clay, what would you like to tell the listeners in terms of who should be checking you guys out, what you're after to make Galileo even bigger and better going forwards, and who can help you?
So Galileo has clearly been a standout in digital banking. Something like 70 out of the top 100 fintechs are clients. 95%, we mentioned that earlier. The thesis between the combination of SoFi and Galileo is really, can we continue to power the ecosystem that Galileo is powering today, but bring in some of the products that SoFi has been so good at creating in a consumer channel? Can we wrap our APIs around that? So these lending and invest products, in particular personal loans, home loans, refinanced student loans, these products, can we make those available out to the broader ecosystem? And these partners all have these lending products in their roadmap. So the future is very, very bright for Galileo, overwhelmingly demanding at this point. We are expanding rapidly. We're live in Mexico. We've got 6 additional countries in LATAM that are currently coming online. We've identified Asia Pacific areas, specifically Hong Kong, Japan, and Singapore, that we're moving into. So doing that, I mentioned the lending products. We've also got a very dominant position in invest. So the ability to invest in a fee-free way and conduct fractional trading and tying together these areas of financial services into the area of investing is all going on now and making Galileo quite exciting.
Excellent. Well, that's very good to hear. I hope that people will check you guys out, and great congratulations on your success, and I wish you more. And just in terms of modelling the change that one wants to see in the world, I've been following the news far too much. I'm trying to de-addict myself recently, and quite a bit of what one sees about America at the moment is not really ideal. It's sort of rather troubling, but the media always tries to pick the scariest things. So it's really a great privilege, Clay, to have you on the show today, to have you sharing the best of what I've always seen about America is the creativity and the openness and the drive to create something that's genuinely useful for the world, and we all leave the world in a little better place than we found it. So thank you very much for that at the business level and also at the modelling level, and I wish you every success in the future.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thanks for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. If you have any challenges or needs with your unlisted company board, get in touch with me at mike@londonfintechpodcast.com.
We could sit in a band there all day, watching the firelight dance, watching the firelight dance. We could walk in the mountains before dawn, watching a happy moon ride, watching a happy moon ride. Come away from the city, with the tarmac so dead and the people so sad. Come away from the city, with the faces so grey, with the pain of the everyday. We are wild like the mountains and the trees. Can you see what I mean? Can you see what I mean? And we fade in between the earth and the sky. Kiss the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye, wave the city goodbye. Wave the city goodbye. Watch the firelight dance with me. 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 Watch the firelight